Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you so much. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. We'll start off with a Fresh School Health and Nutrition webinar series as we have more people joining the room. My name is Mohini Venkatesh, and I'm from Save the Children. And welcome again to the April 2019 Fresh webinar. Before I introduce today's webinar, just a bit about the series, which are monthly presentations on school health and development in low and middle income countries, jointly organized by Fresh partners. Every month, we commemorate a special day by inviting experts on a health topic to share their knowledge and experience. Today, we're observing World Health Day, which took place on the 7th of April, with a talk on reimagining school health and its changed landscape. We'll hear more about that and what it means. As we celebrate World Health, the World Health Day theme of universal access to health for all. Joining us to speak on the topic are Dr. Leslie Drake and Linda Schultz. A bit of introduction on our speakers. Leslie is the Executive Director of the Partnership for Child Development based at Imperial College London. Leslie has spent a significant part of her career developing and translating quality research into evidence-based, scalable, and sustainable solutions. Those of us who know Leslie from several decades know she was integral to putting together the Fresh framework back in 2000, Fresh standing for Focusing Resources on Effective School Health. And that really laid out the common principles around which we see school health being implemented across the board, drawing from experiences from several UN and international agencies. Now to Linda. And Linda is a health and education consultant with 10 years of experience working with multilateral and bilateral organizations, governments, and academic institutions. Linda is an expert on human capital, child and adolescent health and development, NTDs, and nutrition. Very glad to have you join the Fresh webinar, Linda. And before I hand over to our speakers, a quick reminder to keep yourselves muted through their presentations. And if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to type them into the chat box. Also, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Over to you, Leslie.
Hi, thank you, Mohini, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts from our side and throw some ideas out to the group at this point in time, which I think is a timely point for us to regroup and think about how we work as a fresh team together. And it's the reason that we decided on the title, which is School Health: The Changed Landscape. And I think if you just put the next slide up, please. So what do I mean by this changed landscape? Over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been some real changes in the way people perceive school health and nutrition and the value of school health and nutrition in improving not just the health and learning education outcomes of children, but also in realizing the potential for those individuals, but also realizing the potential for the country and the investment that school health can make in the country's investment in their human capital. And now there's a sea change in the way that policymakers and funders are looking at school health, and they're raising their awareness of it in terms of their investments and their understanding of what we can contribute. And so the next slide is really about what led to this landscape change, and that was fundamentally due to the generation of the evidence and the value of school health moving forward. Next slide, please. So we all know there's been an accumulation of evidence over the years, but as I said, over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been some really significant changes. And just to summarize a few, and we'll go into them in more detail later in the presentation, but it really was the publication of DCP3, which is the Disease Control Priorities third edition, on child and adolescent, and this was for the first time having a whole volume of this influential documentation that I'll let Linda talk about a little bit more in detail later. But we had a whole volume set aside for child and adolescent health and development. And that was a sea change in itself, that the health community as well as the education community were seeing school health and child and adolescent health as something that was of great value. One of those pieces that came out of DCP3 was this whole concept of the 8,000 days. So ordinarily, for many years, we've been looking at the 1,000 days, which is the first 1,000 days of life. And there is no question that that is fundamentally important to the child's development. But my question has always been, but what happens when a child is 1,001 days old? How are we leveraging our investments on this moving forward? So we take really good care of these kids for the first 1,000. But how do we move that forward into another platform and then yet another platform to see these children through to adulthood? And when you think about where 8,000 days takes you, it takes you to about anywhere, say 20 years, which most countries recognize as that child now becoming an adult and an important part of that adult population that is contributing to the workforce, contributing to the potential of the country. And so looking at all of the different platforms like IMCI, ECD, school health, and now importantly recognizing the importance of the adolescent piece in all of this, we're now trying to join together to look at 8,000 days, building on the investments that are already being fundamentally invested in the first 1,000 days. The other thing that happened over the last couple of years is the understanding of the link between human capital and development. And I'm going to let Linda talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But also the World Bank realizing how important human capital was. And if you see on the map on the right of this screen, you can see that they put a map together of all of the countries and put an index together of where they featured in the human capital index, as they called it. Next slide. And so I'm going to hand over to Linda just to go into more depth of those 4 key pieces before we go on to some more programmatic evidence into action scenarios moving forward. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Mohini, and thanks all for joining. As Leslie provided a great introduction into what we'll be discussing, I'm going to dig a little deeper in some of the 4 points that Leslie touched on. And the first is the disease control priorities. And I'm going to aim to be brief in my summary because I know that there's been prior fresh webinars that have focused on the disease control priorities. So I'll try and give an overview and link it to the other 3 pieces that Leslie just referenced. So as a background, the disease control priorities is a global health resource for policymakers, health professionals, and health implementers. And it's an economic take on health that has been really influential in communicating health needs and health investments to ministers of finance over the years. The disease control priorities was born out of the World Bank World Development Report, which was published in 1993, which focused on investments in health. And interestingly, it's this report that Bill Gates points to as one of the most influential documents that inspired him to create the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. 13 years later, you then see the second edition of the disease control priorities being published. And the second edition was a notable expansion from the first. It had over 70 chapters that looked at individual health topics and health systems issues. The disease control priorities is now in its third decade and third edition, and it's an even more comprehensive look at global health. Next slide, please. So the disease control priorities third edition is structurally organized a bit differently than in the prior two editions. So this time around, there's 9 topical volumes, and you can see in this slide that the 9 volumes capture the vast majority of the major health conditions that affect the well-being and development of individuals in low and middle income countries. And one of the most significant contributions of this series is the development of what we refer to as essential packages. An essential package is a collection of interventions that are effective, they're cost effective, they're feasible, and they're priorities for introduction in low and middle income countries. And across the 9 volumes, there's a total of 21 essential packages. I'd like to direct your attention to volume 8, which is the volume that has this green circle around it. As Leslie mentioned, this is the first time in the history of the Disease Control Priorities series where there is an expanded analysis. I'm sorry, I think there's a bit of background noise. If people could just keep themselves muted, that'd be helpful. So for the first time in the Disease Control Priorities series, there's an expanded analysis of how health status affects the development of school-aged children, how ill health affects children's ability to benefit from education, and how this might manifest differently for girls and for boys at different points across their developmental trajectory. Volume 8 was developed with contributions from 110 global experts. It spans 30 chapters. And I'd like to point out that Leslie Drake, who is co-presenting with me, is a lead author on a chapter on school feeding. She's also contributed to several chapters within the volume. And I served as the coordinator and contributed to several chapters as well. And this volume was led by Dr. Donald Bundy as the lead editor. Next slide, please. It might be a little difficult to see the nuance in this slide, but I'm going to try and give the general purpose of what this slide shows. So the Disease Control Priorities Volume 8 editors developed this conceptual framework to show that there is a continuum of physical and cognitive growth and development that occurs from birth all the way through the introduction to adulthood. So this day 1 all the way through the 8,000 days. And so in the first panel, you see that there's periods of intense height gain, so in the very early stages of life, but then again in puberty. And then you see in the second panel these intense periods of changes in brain development that occur throughout the life course. And the darker blue indicates periods of intensity for different types of myelination and synaptic pruning, etc. And the third panel shows changes in the volume as a proportion of your brain, depending on your age. And so as you can see, there's significant opportunity to be intervening at very specific time points along this 8,000 days. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the Disease Control Priorities third edition includes essential packages, and volume 8 includes 2 essential packages. One looks at the school age child from age 5 to 14, and an adolescent package from age 15 to 19. And functionally, you would need a combination of both of these packages to reach adolescents more generally between ages 10 to 19. So just to give you like a brief introduction, the school age package utilizes the primary school as the delivery platform to address the common health concerns of children in this age group. And it includes interventions where the intervention is recommended for all children. So an example of that would be oral health promotion, as well as interventions that are are recommended for screening and treatment of only a subset of a population. And one example of that would be eye vision screening, let's say at the start of primary school or the start of secondary school. The second package focuses on older adolescents, and it uses a mixed approach. So it involves a community platform, it still uses the school, involves media and health systems, and it recommends health messaging, health education, and adolescent-friendly health services. Next slide, please. What's really interesting about this volume, and I think it's would be interesting to this community as well, is that the disease control priorities has traditionally been seen as a resource for the health community. But this volume in particular has resonance that extends beyond the health sector exclusively. So with that in mind, the Secretariat for DCP3 worked with different global bodies to ensure that the messages were seen by relevant sectors. So it's unlikely that an education specialist would pick up a volume that entitled Child and Adolescent Health and Development, but would be more likely to pick up a volume if the title says Optimizing Education Outcomes. So with that in mind, in March of 2018, the Disease Control Priority Secretariat and the Global Partnership for Education worked to publish a compendium publication to volume 8. And this includes 16 chapters of the original 30 from our volume 8. And the chapters that were selected selected because of their potential to inform financing decisions for better education results. Very similarly, the Disease Control Priority Secretariat worked with the World Food Program to produce a compendium publication with chapters specifically selected to show how well-designed school feeding programs can promote human capital in low and lower middle income countries. And this book includes a preface by David Beasley, who's the head of World Food Program, and Jim Kim, who was formerly the president of the World Bank, and this was launched in August 2018. So you can see that Volume 8 has continued to have a life long beyond its publication. Next slide. And the volume continues to influence other thought pieces. So the Disease Control Priorities Volume 8 most recently served as the foundation for a USAID commissioned report to discuss what further actions ministries of health and education and labor and youth and finance can take to align investments to improve the human capital potential of its population. And this report was triggered by a couple of different factors. And so one is this recognition of the link between human capital and development. So in 2018, the World Bank released its Changing Wealth of Nations report. And this report concluded that the greatest driver of economic growth and prosperity is its people. In building on that report, the World Bank started to develop what Leslie referred to or introduced earlier as the Human Capital Index. And while this index was in its development, we knew that it was looking at the kinds of building blocks that inform human capital. So the investments that help children survive to school age, investments to get children into school and to ensure quality schooling, and investments in health. And it was this development of an index that really catalyzed a conversation around the importance of investments in health and education along a life course. And the third piece is that USAID is working with countries on their journey to self-reliance, and the messages that were coming out of the importance on human capital and investments along the life course to ensure the foundational skills to be competitive in a evolving global economy really resonated. And so the evidence base from the Disease Control Priorities Child and Adolescent Health and Development volume served as the evidence base for this report. To also kind of close the circle, Leslie Drake and I served as co-authors on this report, along with our colleague Laura Appleby, who unfortunately is not part of this conversation or part of this webinar, and Dr. Donald Bundy served as the report advisor. Next slide, please. Within our report, we identified 5 key messages which we think have relevance for the larger FRESH community as well. And so the first is coming out of this Changing Wealth of Nations report, that the aggregated skills and knowledge of a population is the single largest driver of economic growth. And this is because human capital reflects a population's ability to adapt, to innovate, and perform competitively in an evolving labor market. And what you can see in this, this map, which was developed by the human capital team at the World Bank, the human capital of a population presently does not equally contribute to economic growth in a country. So wealthier nations, the scale of contribution is thought to be around 70%, but it's closer to 40% in poorer countries. And it's this discrepancy that shows us that the contribution to human capital to economic productivity has been underexploited in low and lower middle income countries. The second message comes out of the disease control priorities, which is that we conclude that effective human capital development requires synergistic investment in health and education across the first 8,000 days. And that there's critical time points throughout this period for investment, and that investment has cumulative returns. So investments made in early childhood education leverages gains made in the first 1,000 days, but also sets a child in motion for the investments that are made in primary school. Next slide, please. The third message is that global investment in both health and education is insufficient and it's unbalanced. So what you can see here is that the investment in health of children under the age of 5 is estimated at somewhere around 29 billion annually in low and lower middle income countries. But when you compare that to children 5 to 19, it's somewhere around 3 billion. And when you look at the same children, 5 to 19, but for education, the investment is somewhere around 70 times larger. You'll also notice in this graph that there's almost undetectable levels of investment in early education, and that there's very little that's being invested in health during the time frame when there's the greatest opportunity for synergy with the investment that's already being made in education. And it's this unbalanced global investment that makes the argument for additional and better targeted investment. When we talk about additional or better targeted, it doesn't rest on the shoulders of either the health sector alone, nor on the shoulders of the education sector alone, but rather that more wisely targeted and timed investments to key periods during the school age years would better leverage the education sector investments that are already being made, and vice versa. Next slide, please. So the fourth point is that there are key phases for intervention in health and education that would better maximize impact on human capital. So those are preconception through the first 1,000 days, early childhood, school age, adolescence, and transition to the labor market. And this goes beyond what's in DCP3 to talk about transitioning into a labor market and post-secondary school. And the fifth message here is that the health sector and the education sector each have tangible and specific areas of investment that require greater attention to improve health capital outcomes. So for health, there's an opportunity to invest more in children at ages when they're in school, because this is the period when children have their most important opportunity to attend school and to learn. Similarly with education, there's an opportunity to invest more in children in the years leading to primary school entrance. The current focus on early childhood development needs to be matched by a focus on early childhood education. And just as one concluding point before I hand it back over to Leslie, health interventions alone do not guarantee improved learning outcomes. and vice versa. We need quality health services and quality education provided together to maximize the full benefit for a child to have his or her greatest opportunity to maximize their human capital potential. And with that, I'll hand it over to Leslie. Leslie, I don't hear you. Perhaps you're on mute?
I'll start again. So thank you, Linda, for that great summary of the evidence. But as we can see, there is a huge body of evidence that that has built up over the last 2 or 3 years, that although everybody here in the FRESH group has always understood the value of school health and nutrition, the value to health outcomes, the value to education outcomes, we've got this huge new piece. And it's looking at human capital and what does that mean for the development, not of just the individual, but of the countries themselves, and how much that means to the country's development. And so, as I said at the beginning, this has turned the heads of policymakers and funders and investors in these areas to really recognize the value of school health and nutrition. And so sometimes things just are left in the academic, oh, isn't this a good thing? So shouldn't we do that? So what we thought we'd do for just a quick summary is some of the evidence into action. Are we seeing things that are happening in countries that we've not seen before? And so next slide, please. And because of time, I'm just going to give you 2 examples here. If you look at Nigeria and South Africa, the 2 biggest programs for school feeding in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that in Nigeria, this was supported by government funds at both federal and state levels across this cross-sectoral engagement between health and education. They've rolled it out, and they have an integrated health and education program in many more states than you can see in this slide right now. But also you can see the same thing in South Africa, where they're taking a different tack, but the same fundamental approach in care and support for teachers and learners. Is the largest and longest running school health program in Africa. It started with Mandela, but this is involved into a comprehensive program including meals, deworming, vaccination, all of the things that Linda was saying about the essential packages. It targets all the children in the economic quintiles 1 to 3 in all 9 provinces. So this now has been reinvigorated in the last 2 or 3 years to really push that fundamental principle of multi-sectoral investments in health and education for the development of children. Next slide. So I'm going to go into a little more depth of one of the programs that I think has really made a huge impact on the country itself, but also on the livelihoods and development of not just children but adults as well. And that's the Nigeria Homegrown School Feeding Program, which is part of the social investment plan of the country. And if you ever wanted to look at a better example of where the country is looking to invest in its own people, then look to Nigeria. So within the social investment program of Nigeria, it's a presidential program, and it has key investments. It's looking to empower youth, it's looking to cash transfers, it's looking to all of these pieces, but it's also that homegrown school feeding is one of the key social investment plans within this program. And it's looking to aim to improve school enrollment and completion, improve child nutrition and health, stimulate local agricultural production, and create jobs and improve family and state economies. And so it's a big vision, but it's sat within a bigger program of social investment in the whole country. And I think this is an important point to make, that we've never really seen this before, that school health and nutrition, school feeding in this instance, has been seen in such a big light, and such a bigger picture for the economic development of a country. Next slide. So here's some figures. So if you look at the financial figures, as Linda was saying, countries are investing in them with their own money. So the homegrown school feeding program in Nigeria's SIP program, there have been puts $1.3 billion into the SIP program. 20% of that budget is now dedicated to the school feeding program. And up to now, over 183 million has been invested into the school feeding program. The reason we say so far is because we're increasing the numbers the whole time. You look at the costs, and we always think of school feeding as being one of the most costly interventions. And so it is, every day feeding, and I will say this right now, 9.5 million children fed per day. Okay. It costs 1.767 million USD to keep this program alive. But that's on a sparse budget is what Nigeria is prepared to pay for this. If you break that down into costs, it's 19 cents per child per day to provide a balanced meal for these 9.5 million beneficiaries. Next slide. So here's a few picks. So as I said, the Nigeria Homegrown School Feeding Program is a presidential initiative. And so on the top picture, you can see the vice president himself, Obasanjo, in a school looking what his program is doing in terms of feeding the children in the schools. And I could give you a multitude of data about enrollment, attainment, all of those indicators that we always look so carefully about. And having the attention of the vice president is something that really pushes things forward. And as we all know, working across the sectors is a real challenge, and school health will always have that. And the primary sectors, education and health, but when you're looking at locally sourced food, you're looking at agriculture, you're looking at local government, you're looking at planning, you're looking at women's affairs. How do you keep that all together? And how do you move the money across the sectors? So Nigeria has also achieved great things about defining the specific roles of the sectors. So what is health responsible for, and how much is it going to cost health to deliver on this package? How much is it going to cost agriculture to deliver on this package? And it's budgeted, and those sectors are responsible to the Ministry of Finance, who are then responsible for the purse strings, and are responsible directly back to the president to account for how his money is being spent. So all of those programs that we all know very well that are sat in a particular sector, and we can just give some to health, but it's difficult to move money across health. A key message to me about the success of this program has been having the political leadership at the top to put his ministers around a table to agree about what the sector involvement is for homegrown school feeding and the SIP program in general. So next slide, please. So here's some numbers. So Nigeria, federal state, 36 states. In the last three years, they have gone from 2 states up to 30 states. And so that's significant coverage already, and it's still growing. The numbers change all the time. We're up to 9.5 million children being fed in 52,000 schools across the nation. Now, one of the reasons that we thought we'd use this example in our presentation to show about the investment in human capital is that it's not just the kids that are being fed and the health and learning opportunities that come from that and learning outcomes that come from that, but also the knock-on effects, so-called externalities. We now have 150,000 farmers, smallholder farmers, that really don't have access to markets or bank accounts or everything, looking at this stable, structured demand for their crops to provide X kilos at Y% cost to the school feeding program. And I'll give you some examples because I think they're pretty amazing. So there's a production volume of 83 metric tons of fish, 6.8 million eggs, and 594 cows. And all of these figures are per week. So forget about, getting the food from external sources. This is Nigeria feeding its own children. It's about Nigeria providing a stable market for its farmers. And I'll give you a very good example of that. One of the first states that we worked in, Osun State, the chicken farmers in Osun State now use the strength of what they found from agricultural extension workers, looking at how they manage their accounts, how they put themselves within cooperatives, and how they work together. So they're not small anymore, but they're working to this one stable budget, this one stable market, but expanding. And going back to my point, the chicken farmers in Osun are now the biggest suppliers of chicken to Kentucky Fried Chicken for the whole of Nigeria. And that started from school feeding. Then you look at the job creation piece, and we have now 101,000 odd cooks and caterers. That's youth employment. They're usually teenage girls that don't have jobs. They get qualified, they get their certificate, they have their job, but they also have new markets. They're now seen with their certificate of being the people that can do weddings and christenings and things at weekends. And they get interest-free loans from the government to buy their own pots and pans. So you can see it's an investment in the rural economies of a country like Nigeria, which has very rural aspects to it. But it's not just the farmers, it's not just the cooks, but they all have uniforms. So the tailors have a market. It goes on and on and on. So it's not just it's a whole, as I said, an investment in the rural economies, job creation, and investment in the human capital moving forward for the development of Nigeria. To the left of that slide, you can see what we're trying to do there is it's not just about providing food willy-nilly, as it were. It's about providing a balanced, nutritious diet based on local foods. So how much can we get from the local foods in the different subcomponents of the nutritious diet that is based on the Nigerian policy, which is a school lunch should be 30% RDA, the recommended dietary amount for that kid through this school meal program. And we've managed to do that at 19 cents per child a day, using locally sourced foods, using the WHO recommendations, using the FAO recommendations, and using those policies to drive this one home. Next slide. Look, just go back one. There's another point to make there. And so it's not just about providing the local foods. It's about that school feeding and the school lunch, but the children being aware of the nutritional value. So going back to fresh, this is an example of where you could take a big market like school feeding, more expensive of an intervention than, say, deworming is, but using the school feeding platform as a way of building on what the investment already is there. So this is an investment in the interventions, where we were talking before, an investment over time as the child moves further towards its 8,000 days. But in Nigeria, again, an example from Nigeria is because we have all the maps of where the worms are in Nigeria, all of the school-aged children in Nigeria are now annually or biannually, dependent on their needs, are dewormed. And that's built on the platform because, as we all know, it's just a few cents on top of this school feeding intervention, only once or twice a year. We're also looking at this health, education, and nutrition intervention, where kids become much more aware of what they're eating, what they shouldn't be eating, the deworming, the health, dental, the vision, all of those things. So it's just, so Nigeria is building on what it's already doing in feeding and putting together a much more comprehensive school feeding package, school health package for its entire school-age child population and its adolescent population. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just leave enough time for us to all react and respond to these. So this is just an access to the different reports that we've talked about if you're interested in them. We've got the Nigeria specific reports that don't seem to be on this list, but we can give you access to that as well if you're interested in those particulars. And what we wanted to open up, so just give me the next slide, please, is given this sea change, given that policymakers are investing, are now seeing the value of school health and nutrition as part of their bigger picture, given the fact that funders are now investing in school health and nutrition as part of this bigger picture, how do we capitalize on this? We've known that school health and nutrition is such a big deal in terms of development, and are we maximizing our skills, our expertise in supporting countries moving forward? And myself and Linda and the team would really like to open this up for discussion and see what you guys all think about how we might move forward as a community. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Linda, for that excellent presentation. To give us that background on the evidence base and what we're seeing as research into policy, and then this very specific example of Nigeria and what Nigeria is doing to maximize human capital through investments in education and health. And now posing the question back to the audience on what can the FRESH community as a whole do to support this sea change as we speak to different stakeholders. And that was also that also triggered my thinking through your talks on how are folks responding to this, whether it's USAID or other constituents, governments. How are we taking this up as practitioners and acting on it within our own organizations or in our external conversations? So I'd like to, perhaps while we wait for folks to react to that question, just hear back from you on how the response has been to what you've presented to the various stakeholders on a global and national, regional, at every level.
Sorry, Mohini, can you repeat the question?
Yes, I wanted to know what the response has been to your your presentation of the 5 key things, the 5 key messages that you shared earlier, and the great examples you have of countries taking greater ownership in your conversations with donors or implementers, policymakers. How have they reacted to the evidence you've presented?
Very well, very positively. I'll give you a very good example of that with GPE, the Global Partnership for Education. The biggest education donor in the world, and are composed of maybe, I think it's 40 donors, bilaterals, philanthropics, all of those grouped together under GPE. And what they've said is that when you develop an education sector, a country develops an education sector plan, and that could be, you know, what do we need for the next 3-5 year cycle for in support of education. You could, how much do I need for teacher training? How much do I need for textbooks? Now there's a line item that they're open to suggestions, and they're saying, if you can provide an evidence-based, budgeted line item within your education sector plan for school health and nutrition, or the interventions that you think are your particular high priorities for your country, then we will consider that as part of an education sector plan. The World Bank is also thinking of reinventing its, and maybe Linda, you can talk a little bit more about this, but there's been a resurgence of interest in the World Bank in terms of its investment in school health and nutrition. Many bilaterals are also looking at this, and many philanthropics are now saying, okay, now I can justify this, but I can take this to the board because there's evidence behind it that shows that this would be a valued investment. And one of the other things that's happening that I think is very important is the justification for countries themselves to continue this investment, their own money investment in these programs. And again, it's the evidence that's driving it. And the governments are saying, yes, we can invest. Yes, we can look at this in terms of, it's not just a 1, 2, 3 year political thing. This is during our term in office. This is something that's of great value to the country, and we want this evidence. We want to invest, and the justification for carrying on that investment is through this evidence. So we're seeing it all fronts. We're seeing it at government level, philanthropics, bilaterals, and also some of the major multilaterals, such as the World Bank, actually just turning their heads a little bit and thinking, you know, this stuff makes sense. And, you know, for the World Bank to turn around and say, yes, we've always thought it was interesting, but now we want to realize how we can invest back into countries in school health, I think is part of the sea change. I mean, these big guys are actually looking at school health and nutrition in a really serious way these days. Maybe Linda, you've got something to add?
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with everything that Leslie said. I think your examples are really poignant and specific and wide-reaching. Mohini, you had asked as part of this question, like, what are some of the bilaterals doing? And I just want to refer back to the prior slide, point 4, about the upcoming Global Partnership for Education webinar on maximizing human capital. So this is going to be a discussion between or with the office that commissioned this report at USAID, speaking specifically about the key messages and its operational implications. And so I really encourage everyone who's interested to see the momentum that is carrying the sea change and the specific actions that are being taken as part of it to tune in on April 25th.
Thanks, Linda. And yeah, and we'll send those details out also as we send out the recording and the slides from this from today's presentation. Just coming back to that question of how can we as a community support what we've known all along, and we have something that documents all of the knowledge and experience and the evidence, packages it and presents it in a way that can be digested by different constituents. I think for me or for folks in the room who work with different stakeholders. It's basically taking this and converting it and speaking it in a language that they understand. So for example, if we're talking about nutrition and those who are interested specifically at adolescents and adolescent nutrition and health, it would mean looking at that 8,000 days, but bringing it, focusing it into that specific age group and presenting it in a way that can get them also excited about what we're all wanting to see, right, in terms of development and achieving those long-term sustainable goals. But perhaps not having the same language of school health. So we try to sometimes, and I've learned this also from Sung and others who may not say school health, may de-emphasize that, but speak that language of, yes, this is important because we're trying to protect children from the potential risks that they are exposed to, whether it's on their way to school because they're going through pubertal changes, or just, changing economies, double burden, whatever we want to be tackling given a context. So that would be my 30-second answer. And here are some questions just from others in the group. One was from Helen saying, has the Nigeria case study been documented somewhere? Specifically, it would be interesting to learn what factors facilitated the scale up as a learning for other countries. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, for sure. So the scale up happened in a really rapid form, and as I said, in a really rapid time. And if you ask me why that happened, it's because you have the key elements of pieces that work. And so I was asked by the Vice President when he was part of the NEPAD initial CADEP investment in school feeding in Nigeria, like 13 years ago now. And of the, I think it was 14 states, only 1.5 succeeded. And he asked me why. And what I said to him was, well, let's see what worked. And, and then we can look at it from a more positive perspective. And I think the key thing that worked was it's this high level political leadership. So it's not siloed in a sector. It's actually, you've got to get these high level guys from the different sectors talking to their boss. And if he's investing his money in this, he wants to know what the different sectors are going to do, how much he's going to have to pay those different sectors to do. And so the rollout happened in a very similar manner to the federal. So the Vice President led the charge. He had all of his ministers, and I'm not saying that was smooth, but it worked in the end, with the Ministry of Finance holding the purse strings. And then that rolled out to the different states. So the governor of each state led that program. He had his ministers, state ministers of the different sectors around the table looking at this, and also looking at the budgets and being transparent about the budgets. The other key thing that happened with Nigeria was it was all forward contracting. So there was when you look at a complex supply chain like school feeding, money changes hands, money gets dropped off the chain. We all know how that happens. But with forward contracting, it's all paper, and so all of a sudden you've got a chain you can track. You've got a governance structure that is monitoring this, and you've also got indicators that we're measuring against success. And so we don't, it's all demand driven. So a few of the states that came on board at first, the governors wanted this and were prepared to take that leadership. And I think when you look at some of the programs that have failed in the past or stayed small, it's because you didn't have that leadership action. And I think the other thing is that, we can't just do this on a voting whim. It has to be put into policy. You have to, and some countries have done it by legal means. They've had laws like in Brazil now. But, putting it out of that subjective and putting it into objective rationale for why we should invest and having that leadership to push it through is what I think has made the key difference in seeing 9.5 million children getting fed daily by local foods and local economies benefiting from that whole process. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just seeing some of the chat questions about where this program is going to go. Why did it scale up so quickly? Where it's going to go is going to be institutionalized into policy. And so it's not a whim anymore. It's something that Nigeria values. It's something that they want to invest in. They see the holes, they see the challenges, and they want people like technical partners and other partners to come in and support that. But it's a fundamental piece of their country's developmental plan moving forward. It's not just a standalone feeding program. It's not a school health program. It's part of the bigger picture. I don't know if that answers that question. Hello.
Hello, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Leslie, that you excellently answered that question. And there was another question in the chat box around community contribution and how the school teachers and PTA were involved. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but these are great questions, and clearly Nigeria has an excellent example for all of us to learn from. So I'd encourage 29 to reach out to our speakers and learn more about the mechanism that was used. And Nigeria being a federal country, I'm sure there's quite a few models out there across the different states. So lots to learn. Thank you so much to our presenters for an excellent presentation and talk, stimulating us to think more along the lines of this renewed landscape for school health and what it means for each of our work. I'd also like to quickly introduce the next webinar. We'll be having that on the 15th of May, a month from now, and it's Wednesday. The topic for next month will be on menstrual hygiene. We'll be commemorating Menstrual Hygiene Day, which falls on the 28th of May. So do look out for an announcement on that beginning of next month. And thank you so much again to all our participants who actively listened and asked questions through the talk. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Linda. And have a very good rest of the week.
Thank you, Martina.